Yeah, really, thank you. Thank you very much. This is the moment when you put your headsets on, and the moment when I explain that the artist whom you know as Van Dyck, I know as Van Dyck. So when I say Van Dyck, I'm talking about the same artist as you are speaking about when you say Van Dyck. What I have done in this, just to comment on something that Gabriele said, we think of ourselves at the Ashmolean not just as the oldest museum in Britain, but the oldest museum, which of course makes the Prado a child by comparison, though a very attractive child, if I may say. What I have done this morning is to follow the instructions I've been given by Alejandro Vergara, who asked me to set the scene, as it were, by speaking about Van Dyck's posthumous reputation and about the literature on Van Dyck from the time of his lifetime until today. Of course, that's a huge task, and I've done my best. But there will be areas that I haven't touched on, and of course, I'm more than happy to take questions during the question session. So let's begin. Anthony Van Dyck was admired as a very young man. On the 17th of July, 1620, Francesco Vercellini, who was the secretary to the Earl of Arundel, wrote from Antwerp to his master in England that Van Dyck, and I quote, is still with Signor Rubens, and his works are hardly less esteemed than those of his master. He is a young man of 21 years, his father and mother very rich, living in this town, so that it will be difficult to get him to leave these parts, especially since he sees the good fortune that attends Rubens. Some of this Vercellini got wrong. Van Dyck's mother had in fact died years earlier in 1607, and his father seems to be experiencing financial difficulties at that time. But the important thing for us is that there can be no doubt of the reputation which Van Dyck already commanded as one of the city's leading artists. 3 years earlier, when Van Dyck was only 18, he had been among the city's leading artists commissioned to paint one picture in the cycle of paintings of the Mysteries of the Rosary for St. Paul's Church in Antwerp. The picture, of course, is in the exhibition. In 1617, he was paid 150 guilders for Christ carrying the cross, and here it is, exactly the same as the older Jordaens and Rubens for their paintings in the series. In fact, as we know, Van Dyck was tempted to England in 1620, and he entered the royal service. He returned to Antwerp in March the following year, and that October he set out for Italy, where he stayed for 6 years, enjoying great success in Rome, Palermo, and Genoa. He arrived back in Antwerp with a well-established reputation, became an official painter to the Archduchess Isabella, and received major commissions, partly as a consequence of Rubens' absence from the city in Spain and England. Van Dyck also travelled to The Hague, where he worked for the stadtholder Frederick Hendrik. It was at the end of 1629 that he informed the English courtier Endymion Porter, who of course is famously in the double portrait here in the Prado. He informed the English courtier Endymion Porter that he had completed the Rinaldo and Armida behind me. And it was this picture, absolutely this picture, presented by Porter to the king, which convinced Charles I that he had discovered another Titian, Titianus Redivivus, whom he proceeded to bring to England in 1632. There, in England, in London, Van Dyck moved in the Catholic circle of courtiers around the Queen, and in particular became a close friend of this man, Kenelm Digby, and painted a number of portraits of Digby and his wife and family. During the English years, Van Dyck was often back in Flanders, particularly in 1634-35, and after the death of Rubens in May 1640, Van Dyck returned to Antwerp on October the 18th to attend a feast of St. Luke, and was granted the status of an honorary dean of the Guild, an honour only previously awarded to Rubens. Van Dyck was evidently planning a return to Antwerp, not least because of the breakdown of civil authority in London. But he was already said to be ill in August 1641. He rushed to Paris for the second time that year in a vain bid to obtain the commission for the decoration of the Grand Galerie du Louvre, but returned to London and died there on December the 4th. This is 1641. He was buried, as he requested in his will, in St. Paul's Cathedral, where the king erected a monument showing Van Dyck as the genius of painting. The monument was destroyed in the Great Fire of London in 1666. Van Dyck had an extraordinarily successful career, measured not just in terms of admiration and wealth, but by the fact that he had transformed portrait painting in the three principal cities in which he worked: Antwerp, Genoa, and London. In Antwerp, his style was not only taken up by local portraitists, but spread throughout the Netherlands. In Amsterdam, for example, the fashionable portraits of Bartholomeus van der Helst, here on the left, and Govert Flink on the right. This, the portrait style, incidentally, which made Rembrandt's portrait style seem so very old-fashioned. These fashionable portraits reveal a profound debt to Van Dyck in scale, technique, and composition. As far as Genoa is concerned, it is no exaggeration to say that the history of portrait painting in Genoa after Van Dyck's departure is essentially one of imitation of his style. Carbone, shown here, Giovanni Bernardo Carbone, is perhaps the most distinguished of these many followers who work in Genoa. In England, the revolution in portrait painting from medieval icon to modern likeness, which had been begun by Van Dyck's Flemish predecessors in the royal service, Paul van Sommer, Daniel Meitens, and Cornelis Johnson, was brought to a triumphant conclusion by Van Dyck. The greatest of his followers in the late 17th century was undoubtedly Sir Peter Lely, who assumed Van Dyck's mantle after the restoration of Charles II in 1660. Lely, who was born in Soest in Westphalia and trained in the studio of Frans de Grebe in Haarlem, was entranced by Van Dyck. He assembled a huge collection of Van Dyck's work, just as Van Dyck had done of Titian. Lely collected paintings and drawings. Among the latter was the famous Italian sketchbook, which is today in the British Museum, and he returned to them again and again when painting portraits of members of Charles II's court. Among the 25 paintings in Lely's collection by Van Dyck were the three children of Charles I and the Cupid and Psyche, both bought at the Commonwealth sales of the Royal Collection, and both returned to the Royal Collection by Lely at the restoration of the monarchy in 1660. Van Dyck's influence on the course of British portrait painting was profound. Both Gainsborough and Reynolds enormously admired Van Dyck. Famously, Gainsborough's last words on his deathbed were said to be, "We are all going to heaven, and Van Dyck is of the party." For Reynolds, Van Dyck was the first of portrait painters. Sir Thomas Lawrence admired, imitated, and collected Van Dyck's work. Queen Victoria could imagine no greater compliment to her favourite portrait painter, Winterhalter, than to say that he was the equal of Van Dyck. Although, let's be frank, she was wrong. He is not the equal of Van Dyck. And John Singer Sargent's visit to the exhibition of Van Dyck's work at the Royal Academy in London in 1901 was profoundly influential on his own portraiture. And here is an example. So it's hardly surprising that such an admired and successful painter has attracted a large literature. All aspects of his life and his career have been examined. The first author to have published a life of Van Dyck was the Flemish poet Cornelis de Bie in his Het Gulden Kabinet and de Edelvrij Schilderkunst, that's to say the Golden Cabinet of the Noble Art of Painting, published in 1661, so 20 years after Van Dyck's death. De Bie, it must be said, is stronger on picturesque anecdote than on fact. For example, it is De Bie who tells us that Van Dyck's mother, Maria Cuypers, was embroidering the story of Susanna when pregnant with Antony. The implication being, of course, that he was destined for a distinguished artistic career, even in the womb. However, the first extensive life of Van Dyck, and by far the most influential, is that by the painter Giovanni Pietro Bellori, published in Rome in 1672. Here's the title page, Le vite dei pittori, scultori e architetti moderni. This long account of his career, and it runs to 11 closely printed pages, is particularly detailed when it concerns his period in England at the court of Charles I. And Bellori gives us the reason why. When writing about the works painted by Van Dyck for Kenelm Digby, who we looked at a moment ago, dressed in armour, he writes, and I quote, "While this gentleman," this is Digby, Kenelm Digby, "while this gentleman was living in Rome during the pontificate of Urban VIII, as resident of the Queen of England, he acquainted me with Van Dyck's career after he went to the court in London. Digby, a lifelong Catholic, was an ardent royalist and went into exile in Paris at the outbreak of the English Civil War. He acted as the Queen Henrietta Maria's treasurer and was in Rome in 1645 and again in 1647, raising money for the royalist cause. And it was on one of those occasions that Digby met Bellori and provided him with information for his life of Van Dyck. I somehow like the idea of the two of them sitting, drinking a cappuccino in the Piazza Navona and talking about Van Dyck. Digby was certainly very close to Van Dyck during his years in London, and for that reason it is evident that Bellori's life is very reliable, particularly in his account of the London years. However, it's not just for the London years that we can rely on Bellori. Digby undoubtedly heard from Van Dyck about his years in Antwerp, his years in Italy, and these accounts also ring true. As Bellori's life is the basis of all subsequent discussions of Van Dyck's career, it's worth considering it in some detail. And in particular, in the context of the exhibition and today's conference, his account of the early years of Van Dyck. So Bellori begins, I quote, "Peter Paul Rubens was renowned throughout Flanders when there appeared in his school in Antwerp a young man possessed of such noble generosity of manners and so fine a talent for painting that he gave every indication that he would bring it distinction and add splendour to the dignity and excellence to which the master had raised his profession. This was Anthony van Dyck, Anthony van Dyck, born in the same city in the year 1599. His father was a trader in fabrics, of which those made in Flanders surpass all others in fineness and workmanship. His mother occupied herself with embroidery and painted with her needle, creating landscapes and figures. With this background, Anthony, at a tender age, set himself to study drawing, and his mother, who was by this time unable to train him further, understood that nature wished to make him outstanding in art. She persuaded his father to place him with Rubens, who, liking the good manners of the young man and his grace in drawing, considered himself very fortunate to have found so apt a pupil, who knew how to translate his compositions into drawings from which they could be engraved. Amongst these is a battle of the Amazons, which was drawn by Anthony at that time. There is just such a drawing, made in preparation for an engraving of 1623 by Lucas Forstermann, after Rubens' painting, which is today in Munich. So that the drawing is in the collection of Christ Church in Oxford, and it's shown in this exhibition, which may or may not be the specific drawing that Bellori is referring to. I looked at it again very, very carefully yesterday afternoon, and it's hard to see Van Dyck's pen strokes, but perhaps it's there. So we know then from Bellori that Van Dyck is in the Rubens studio, and one of his tasks in the studio is to take compositions by Rubens and turn them into drawings, which are then given to the engraver, in this case Forstermann. So I continue with Bellori's account. Rubens gained no less profit from Van Dyck in painting, since, being unable to fulfill the great number of his commissions, he employed Anthony as a copyist and set him to work directly on his own canvases, to sketch out and even execute his designs in paint, activities which brought him very great benefit. And this is important. Anthony made the cartoons and the painted pictures for the tapestries of the story of Decius and other cartoons, which because of his great talent he carried out quite easily. It is said that in this way Rubens's business prospered, and he came to earn a good 100 florins a day from his pupils' labours, while Anthony profited still more from his master, who was a veritable treasury of artistic skills. So here we have absolutely clear evidence for Van Dyck's leading role in Rubens' studio, his participation in the creation of the Decius Mus tapestry cartoons, and in my view, not that of the authors of the catalogue, I think, but in my view, Van Dyck's participation in the Decius Mus cartoons can be, which survive and are in the Liechtenstein collection in Vienna. I believe that that Van Dyck's participation in those cartoons can be seen, and of course in other paintings which are clearly collaborations from the studio of Rubens, such as the Theodosius and Ambrose in Vienna. So let me continue with Bellori. Bellori, may I repeat, is absolutely at the heart of any subsequent discussion of Van Dyck. Bellori then goes on to say, this is fascinating, but it occurred to Rubens that his disciple was well on the way to usurping his, Rubens, fame as an artist, and that in a brief space of time his reputation would be placed in doubt, Rubens' reputation. And so, being very astute, he took the opportunity from the fact that Antony had painted several portraits, and praising them enthusiastically, he proposed him in his place to anyone who came to ask for such pictures in order to take him away from history painting. For the very same reason, Valori continues, Titian even more harshly dismissed Tintoretto from his house, and Valori is taking that account from Ridolfi's famous 1648 account of painting in Venice. And Valori continues, many other artists who have followed a similar course have in the end been unable to repress brilliant and highly motivated students. This is, of course, an extremely interesting statement. It's repeated in numerous subsequent lives of Van Dyck, and it may well, I think, reflect Van Dyck's own view. Certainly, his rival with Rubens was entirely conscious. Remember that after Rubens' death in 1640, the Cardinal Infante asked Van Dyck to complete paintings destined for the King of Spain, but left unfinished in Rubens' workshop. Now, surely most artists would have accepted this royal commission as a tribute to an artist of a previous generation who had done so much Van Dyck in his career. But Van Dyck refused to do so. He would paint new works, but he would not complete the work of Rubens. Valori clearly suggests that this wish of Rubens to push Van Dyck in the direction of portraiture constituted a break in the relationship. And continues, Antony therefore removed himself from the school of Rubens, and it is said that he then made in the church of St. Dominic the picture of Christ carrying the cross, having fallen on his knees with the Marys and the soldiers who lead him to Calvary. This work is still in his early Rubensian style. That's Valori. In fact, of course, this painting still hangs in the Dominican church of St. Paul in Antwerp. It's in the exhibition here. And Valori then goes on to say that, thinking it was time to set off for Italy, he left his native country and made his first stop in Venice. Here then, in Valori's account of Van Dyck, are all the main themes of the present exhibition. Van Dyck, the prodigy, trained initially by his mother, then by Rubens, his role as a key assistant to Rubens, his complicated, tense relationship with the elder painter, the tension between portraiture and history painting, of course, was considered to be a far higher calling for an artist in the 17th century. Of course, what Valori leaves out, the omissions, are interesting as well. Valori is unaware, it seems, that Hendrik van Baarle and not Rubens was Van Dyck's first master. And even more puzzlingly, he was unaware of Van Dyck's trip to London in 1620-21. Perhaps these omissions are the result of the delay between his conversations with Digby in Rome in the mid-1640s. Remember, it's either 45 or 47 that they have their cappuccino in the Piazza Navona, and the eventual publication of his book in 1672. So let me continue a little with Valori's account. He tells us that Van Dyck's first stop in Italy was Venice, where he gave himself over completely to the painting of Titian and Paolo Veronese. There is an admiring account of the portraits of Cardinal Bentivoglio, there it is, and the extraordinary portraits of Sir Robert and Lady Shirley, both portraits, all three portraits, done in Rome. He then gives a fascinating account of Van Dyck in Rome. Van Dyck was still a young man, his beard scarcely grown, but his youthfulness was accompanied by a grave modesty of mind and nobility of aspect, for all his small stature. Remember, like Napoleon, Van Dyck was a small man. His manners were more those of an aristocrat than a common man, and he was conspicuous for the richness of his dress and the distinction of his appearance, having been accustomed to consort with noblemen while a pupil of Rubens. And being naturally elegant and eager to make a name for himself, he would wear fine fabrics, hats with feathers and bands, and chains of gold across his chest, and he maintained a retinue of servants. Thus, imitating the splendors of Xerxes, and as always these references to classical artists mentioned in Pliny, of course, throughout, Bellorian indeed, of course, throughout the work of his contemporaries. So thus, imitating the splendor of Xerxes, he attracted the attention of all who saw him. This conduct, which should have recommended him to the Flemish painters who lived in Rome, in fact stirred up against him the greatest resentment and hatred. For they were accustomed at that time to live cheerfully together, and it was their practice, when one of them was newly arrived in Rome, to take him to supper at an inn and give him a nickname by which he was afterwards known. Antony refused to participate in these bacchanals, and they, taking his reserved manner for contempt, condemned him as ambitious, criticizing both his pride and his art. And indeed he had come to Rome not to study, but with the intention of working and displaying his talent for a beautiful and pleasing facility in painting. But the others, it's the other Flemish artists, disparaging his abilities and saying he did not know how to draw and could scarcely paint a head, reduced him to such a state that he left Rome in despair and returned to Genoa. This is a completely fascinating account, I think, in many, many respects. Van Dyck's taste for luxury, his fastidious refusal to join the Bentwergels. The Bentwergels were this group of Flemish artists who worked and lived together in Rome. So his fastidious refusal to join the Bentwergels in their drunken rituals, his sensitivity to criticism, but most significantly, in my view, the clear statement that he was in Italy not to study, but to work. Van Dyck, the prodigy, was a fully formed artist when he arrived in Italy. And although he was anxious, of course, to see more Italian painting, and especially the work of Titian, he was there to work and to carry out important commissions like the portrait of Bentivoglio and the great Palermo altarpiece, here it is, which is described in detail by Bellori. Bellori is anxious to point out that Van Dyck, although famous as a portrait painter, and I quote, produced quite a number of altarpieces and other compositions for commissions throughout Flanders and elsewhere, enhancing his reputation. And he describes a number of these in detail. I just want to say a word about Bellori's account of the of the London years too. Bellori's account of the London years is, of course, especially detailed. He mentions that Rubens had already visited the court of Charles I, and I quote, "When Rubens left, Van Dyck succeeded him in royal favour and at once began to accumulate the rewards and resources he needed to maintain his ostentatious style and his splendid way of life. However, he spent his new riches liberally, since his house was frequented by the highest nobility, following the lead of the king, who used to visit him and take pleasure in watching him paint and spending time with him. In magnificence, he rivaled Parrhasius." Here again, reference to a classical artist, of course, from Pliny. In magnificence, he rivaled Parrhasius, keeping servants, carriages, horses, musicians, singers, and clowns, who entertained all the dignitaries, knights, and ladies who visited his house, Van Dyck's house, every day to have their portraits painted. Moreover, he had lavish dishes prepared for them at his table at the cost of 30 scudi a day. And this, I love this passage in Bellori. "This may seem incredible to anybody accustomed to our Italian frugality. quite where this idea of Italian frugality comes from. English extravagance and Italian frugality is not a concept I recognize, but anyway, it's very interesting here. This may seem incredible to anybody accustomed to our Italian frugality, but not to those familiar with foreign countries, nor if one takes into account the number of persons he fed. For beside those already mentioned, he employed men and women who served as models for the portraits of the lords and ladies, since having rendered the likeness of the face, he would then complete the remainder from these live models. Once again, there is much of interest here, not just the lavishness of Van Dyck's style of life, but evidence of his portrait practice, using as models for hands and bodies members of his own circle and household. I show you, incidentally, the first great portrait of the royal family, painted. It's the first portrait done by Van Dyck after he arrived in England of Charles I, Henrietta Maria, and the two eldest children. Bellori then describes in remarkable detail many of Van Dyck's English period works, notably the portrait commissioned from him by Kenelm Digby of Digby's recently deceased wife. This, which I show you, is an allegorical portrait, the iconography of which has clearly been designed by Digby himself. For that reason, it stands alone within Van Dyck's portrait oeuvre, as Van Dyck himself was disinclined to use any but the most conventional allegorical elements in his portraiture. Bellori tells us of a substantial group of religious works painted by Van Dyck in England for the Catholic circle around the Queen, which have not survived. He goes on to tell us that the relentless pace of portrait painting for the English court contributed to undermining Van Dyck's health. And, I quote, he hoped to dedicate himself to a more tranquil type of work, far removed from the business of the court, which would bring him both honour and profit, and thus leave a record and memorial of his talents for posterity. He tells us, very interestingly, of the designs for hangings or tapestries for the great saloon of the Royal Court of Whitehall in London. This is a fascinating commission for a series of tapestries to be hung in the banqueting house in London, and the only record we have of this commission, this extremely important royal commission, is this sketch, oil sketch, which we were fortunately recently able to acquire for the Ashmolean in Oxford. It's very hard to reproduce. I've got a detail here under the, you can see this is the king in the procession under the baldachin. The king is there. I mean, they're moving along Whitehall. Though, if you look at the whole thing, you can see that in some strange way, because Van Dyck's been looking at Veronese, as they walk down Whitehall in London to the banqueting house, they somehow go via Venice. You can see a hint of Venice, of Veronese's Venice, as they move down Whitehall. This is important because this is strong evidence, of course, of Van Dyck's wish not to be seen exclusively, even during the English years, as a portrait painter, but to undertake large and ambitious historical commissions. In the event, Charles I, the war was just breaking out, and Charles I couldn't afford to commission the tapestries. Bellori writes of Van Dyck's hopes to be awarded the commission for the Grande Galerie du Louvre. After all, in Rubens' great Marie de' Medici series, there was a precedent for a Flemish artist being awarded such a key royal commission. But in the event, this went to Poussin. Bellori concludes his lengthy account with remarks about Van Dyck's working practice and the inevitable comparison with Rubens. Regarding his method of painting, this is Bellori, he was in the habit of working without a break, and when he made portraits, he would begin them in the morning to gain time, and without interrupting his work would keep his sitters with him over lunch. After his meal, he would return to the picture, or else do 2 in a day, adding the final retouching later. This was his usual practice for portraits. If he was making history paintings, he estimated how much work he could carry out in a day and did no more. He made use of reflections and cast shadows, and having planned in advance the location of these highlights, these would emerge in due time with force and grace. In this respect, he followed his master Rubens, observing the same rules and maxims of painting, except that Van Dyck's flesh tones were more delicate and closer to the colours of Titian. Very interesting remark. Van Dyck's flesh tones more delicate than those of Rubens and closer to the colours of Titian. Yet he was not so fertile in his inventions, nor did he have Rubens' talent and facility in large and crowded compositions, the harmony of his colours being more appropriate to a small room. He won the greatest praise for his portraits, in which he was unrivalled, as sometimes as marvellous as Titian himself. In history painting, however, he did not show himself so accomplished and steady in design, nor were his basic conceptions altogether satisfactory, so that in this and other respects he lacked the qualities needed for devising elaborate compositions. In addition to all that has been said of the habits of this artist, he was good, honest, noble, and generous, and despite his small stature, there again the Napoleon complex, and despite his small stature, he was well proportioned, graceful, and handsome, with the typical pale skin and fair hair of his native climate. All subsequent writers on Van Dyck have followed Bellori. Indeed, the principal writers on Van Dyck of the late 17th century all reveal a very powerful debt to Bellori. I'm going to run through them. You don't need to remember these names, but I'm going to run through them. Raffaele Soprani in 1674, Joachim van Sandrart in the following year in 1675, Isaac Bullard in 1682, André Philibien in 1685, Florent Lecomte in 1699, Roger de Pile also in the same year, 1699. You don't need to remember the names. All base their accounts on Bellori. For example, de Pile wrote, Van Dyck was a person of low stature, but well-proportioned, very handsome, modest, and extremely obliging, and moreover a great encourager of all those in his country who excelled in any art. He always went magnificently dressed, had a numerous and gallant equipage, and kept so noble a table in his apartment that few princes were more visited or better served. As you can see, this is more or less taken absolutely directly from Bellori. Yet each early biographer, if you go through these lives, adds a little more information, much of it anecdotal, but some of the greatest significance. For example, Sandrart, Joachim van Sandrart, von Sandrart, he's German, a practicing artist who was a slightly older contemporary of Van Dyck, who certainly knew Rubens and who had lived in London, Venice, and Amsterdam, and is largely reliable, underlines Bellori's assertion that Van Dyck assisted Rubens in the paintings of large-scale works, and this is a comment, of course, that calls again vividly to mind the Decius Mus series. Isaac Bullard stresses Rubens's generosity towards the young Van Dyck, and it's he who in 1682 first tells the story of the altarpiece of St. Martin in the church in Zaventem. I'm very sorry that I know that there was a long negotiation to get this picture here to Madrid. It's a great shame that it's not here. It's a very beautiful and important picture. There it is. Zaventem, by the way, is the name, is if you get off the aeroplane at Brussels Airport, that is in Zaventem. So it's a very quick journey to get to the Church of St. Martin, and I do recommend you to take it. An outstanding one of the great early masterpieces of Van Dyck. So it's Bullard who tells the story, first of all, that Van Dyck was in love with a local girl in Zaventem, and for that reason he was very happy to undertake this commission and to linger in the village. Again, André Philibien, writing 3 years after Bullard, tells us that Rubens had great affection for the young Van Dyck and taught him with very special care, that in a sense Van Dyck was a very special pupil of Rubens. And in return, Philibien notes, the young painter was very useful to Rubens, as the paintings he assisted on were then sold by Rubens as Rubens's authentic work. There is one particular jewel in de Piel's account of Van Dyck, and this was given to the author by Everard Jabach. There he is, the Cologne banker and collector who sat to Van Dyck in 1636 or 1637. This is incidentally a fascinating portrait, which is in St. Petersburg, as you can see, because it shows the Rye Tower. It shows the tower and the town of Rye in the background, and why Jabach should have chosen that. He comes from Cologne, he's on his way to London, he no doubt crosses the Channel to Rye, and this represents his setting first foot in England. Perhaps that's the significance, but very interesting that he should have chosen this as the background. So this is Jabach. This is Jabach sitting to Van Dyck in London, 36 or 37, and he gives information to de Piel. He meets de Piel in Paris and talks to de Piel about sitting to Van Dyck, and he talks about the process. So sittings lasted exactly 1 hour, he says, after which his valet, Van Dyck's valet, came to clean his brushes and prepare another palette, while he, Van Dyck, received the next person to whom he had given an appointment. He worked on several portraits at the same time, sketching out the portrait on the canvas, making drawings on grey paper of pose and clothes, and sadly very, very few of these drawings have survived, which he would pass to his assistants to make the painted portrait. He would then go over the results and I quote de Piel, and thanks to his intelligence, impart to them in no time at all the art and the truth to nature which we admire. There are also important early 18th century lives of Van Dyck by Arnold Houbraken, 1718, and a wonderful life by the almost comically unreliable Jacob Campo Weyermann in 1729. Weyermann is, however, extremely interesting on the relationship with Rubens, stressing Van Dyck's impatience with the older painter and his anxiousness to establish his own independent reputation. Here then, in these early biographies of Van Dyck, is a portrait of the artist we recognize, the prodigy, the passion for Titian, the early success in Antwerp and Italy, the call to London, the taste for luxury, and by implication for court life, the supreme skill as a portrait painter, but on the other side, the inability to rival Rubens as a history painter, the lack of interest in the antique, the intense religious belief, and the lack of humanist interests. Very interesting, all this. Very much a deliberate contrast set up by these early biographers of Van Dyck with Rubens. Stress on all those years in Italy and no significant interest in the antique or in classical culture. His intense religiosity, his intense religious belief, his commitment as a Catholic, very much as a Counter-Reformation artist, and his lack of conventional humanist interests. He is not the pictor doctus that Rubens clearly is. Naturally, much more information and many more documents have come to light subsequently, not least during the second half of the 19th century, which was, of course, a heroic period for archival research. And I'll just summarize a few of these. In 1844, William Carpenter published his pictorial notices consisting of a memoir of Sir Anthony van Dyck with a descriptive catalogue of the etchings executed by him. This brought to light a number of important documents concerning Van Dyck's years in England. Still more were published by Noel Sainsbury in 1859 in original unpublished papers illustrative of the life of Sir Peter Paul Rubens, and it was Sainsbury who first published the letter of November 1620 from Toby Matthew to Dudley Carleton, which announces that Van Dyck had left Antwerp for England. So that's the first time in the literature that the first visit to England is mentioned. In 1868, it's Galesloot published the documents about the 1661 court case of Cardinal Hillewerfer, Canon, I don't make him a cardinal, Canon Hillewerfer, concerning the authenticity of the early series of apostles. And in 1883, Van den Branden published his discoveries in the Antwerp archives. In the 1890s, Menotti scoured the Genoese archives for references to Van Dyck's sojourn in that city. And the two important studies of the artist by Alfred Michiels and Jules Giffray, which both appeared in Paris in 1881 and 1882, respectively, owed much to this archival harvest. There is in the Louvre a manuscript biography of Van Dyck, which from internal evidence can be dated to about 1780. It's hard to date it. It's a manuscript, it's a life of the artist. The author is unknown, though there have been a number of proposed identifications. But what is important about this life, this manuscript life, is that the author had access to a series of letters which have subsequently been lost between Cornelis de Waal in Genoa and this man, Lucas van Uffel, in Venice, in which they're both friends of Van Dyck. They talk about Van Dyck's movements in Italy, and it's from this account and the evidence we're given also by the Italian sketchbook, which I mentioned earlier, that we can trace Van Dyck's precise itinerary during his stay in Italy. It was Maurice Vaz who, in a series of articles in the Bulletin de l'Institut Belge de Rome in the 1920s, published this biography for the first time and established Van Dyck's Italian itinerary. Archival research on Van Dyck continues, and it's only very recently that we learned from the Antwerp archives about Van Dyck's father's financial difficulties, and indeed from the archives in Palermo about the length of his stay in that city. As this scholarly search for documentary evidence has proceeded, a series of exhibitions, of which the present exhibition here in Madrid is the most recent, have continued to re-evaluate the artist and his reputation. In 1899 and 1900, a major exhibition on the occasion of Van Dyck's 300th anniversary was held in Antwerp and London. It was organised by Lionel Cust, who was the director of the National Portrait Gallery in London, and it's not surprising to find that it concentrated on the artist's portraiture and particularly on the portraits of the English period. And at the same time, in 1900, Cust published a monograph on Van Dyck. Cust reviewed the life and work of Van Dyck, writing particularly eloquently on the English period and the English portraits. But, and this is the fascinating aspect of the book, which the part of the book that fascinates me particularly, there is no doubt at all that the British Victorian Museum director found certain aspects of the Baroque artist's personality, as revealed in the early lives and the documents, rather unsettling. Van Dyck was highly strung. He was temperamental. He was extravagant. And he claimed the prodigy's right to be willful, arrogant, and haughty. He was not learned, as the humanist painters of the Renaissance, and indeed many of his Flemish contemporaries, notably Rubens, were. He was largely uninterested in classical literature and art, and he was intensely religious in the emotionally charged manner of the Counter-Reformation. Cust was often out of sympathy with the man, and this affected his consideration of Van Dyck's work, and in particular, his religious paintings. Indeed, and remember, this is 1900, very significantly, he's unable to account for certain traits in Van Dyck's character, and so he writes of the feminine side of Van Dyck's nature. And I think by that he means, and excuse me, this is 1900, he meant his piety, his emotionalism, his vanity, and his volatility. The first quarter of the 20th century saw a remarkable period of Van Dyck scholarship in Germany and Austria, with the work of Rudolf Gluck, a remarkable figure who lived and worked in Vienna. They worked at the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna, and then subsequently moved to America, Gluck published on Van Dyck from 1905 until 1939, so many, many publications. And Heinrich Rosenbaum, whose 1928 thesis, Der junge Van Dyck, underpins this exhibition in Madrid more than 80 years later. And just as a footnote that I enjoy, perhaps anyway, Rosenbaum, very interesting figure, Heinrich Rosenbaum, who, as I say, laid the foundations with his 1928 thesis for much of the present work. He subsequently moved to London. He anglicized his name to Henry Rowland, and he founded the great art dealing firm of Rowland, Browse and Del Banco, which specialized in early 20th century art. I mean, very famous art dealing firm in London, and that is the Heinrich Rosenbaum of Der junge Van Dyck. My own monograph on Van Dyck of 1982, oh dear, what a long time ago, of 1982 was the first since Cust, and in writing it I was very eager to correct this bias because it's clear to me that Van Dyck's precociousness, his religiosity, his love of luxury had a significant influence on the kind of pictures he painted and the way in which he painted them. I also set out very deliberately to counteract Cust's bias towards Van Dyck's English period by devoting more space to his years in Flanders and Italy. There have then been a number of key exhibitions since the Second World War. In Genoa in 1955, there was an exhibition at the Palazzo dell'Accademia which stressed his achievement in Italy, and it notably showed the great Palermo altarpiece, which we've just looked at, one of the absolutely supreme masterpieces of Van Dyck. It showed it outside the Oratorio del Rosario for the first time, and the only time. I tried very hard to get it to London 10 years ago, but without success. Oliver Miller organized two memorable exhibitions, The Age of Charles I at the Tate in 1972, and Van Dyck in England, National Portrait Gallery 10 years later. Van Dyck as a religious artist, organized by Jack Martin and Gail Feigenbaum at the Princeton Art Museum in 1979, was a further revelation of this aspect of Van Dyck's activity. And then in 1980, in Ottawa, was the forerunner of this Prado show, also called The Young Van Dyck. The organizer, Alan McNairn, grappled, as the present organizers have done, with some very difficult issues. When did this prodigy actually start to work? What was the nature of his relationship with Rubens? And more intricately, and it makes your head spin to think about it, how do the early series of apostles fit together? And Alan McNairn laid the foundation for the excellent work which we celebrate here at the Prado today. In 1990, Arthur Wheelock, Susan Barnes, and Julius Held collaborated on a splendid monographical exhibition at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, which included 87 paintings, a group of 15 oil sketches. And it was here that this extraordinary portrait, which I show you on the screen, George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, and his wife, Catherine Manners, as Venus and Adonis. I mean, it requires a degree of self-love to commission a portrait of yourself as Adonis, but he did it, and he was not short of self-love. This was painted in England in 1620-21, and it was published for the first time in that exhibition. Much of the discussion, however, of that exhibition among the specialists concerned the group of oil sketches, which included a number of speculative attributions. Here, for example, the two oil sketches which are related to the great altarpiece for the Augustinian church in Antwerp. The first on the left, the first sketch, which incidentally displaced a sketch in the Ashmolean, it became clear that the Oxford sketch was a copy. This is indeed the original, but the question with the second one, of course, is whether it's by Van Dyck or whether it's by the engraver in preparation for the engraving after the altarpiece. This is I hope this doesn't sound too much like medieval schoolmen, but this is what the specialists concern themselves with. The catalogue was a very valuable publication with a number of stimulating essays. There was also a great symposium, the papers of which were subsequently published by the Washington National Gallery. And intended to coincide with that exhibition was a show of Van Dyck drawings, which I selected and catalogued, shown in 1991 in New York at the Pierpont Morgan Library and then in the Kimball Museum in Fort Worth. It included 91 sheets from the early pen drawings, which are so beautifully represented here in Madrid, to the late landscape watercolours made in England. And it's very important to mention that my exhibition catalogue and the catalogue here, the consideration of the drawings, rests on the very, very solid foundations established by a dear friend of mine, who sadly died recently, Horst Fey, who published an exemplary catalogue of Van Dyck drawings in 1962. Then, in 1997, Susan Barnes, who was one of the Washington team, who had written her doctoral thesis on Van Dyck's Italian period, and Piero Boccado, who has an unrivaled knowledge of the Genoese archives, collaborated with other Genoese colleagues on Van Dyck a Genova, Grande Pittura e Collezionismo, which placed Van Dyck among his Genoese contemporaries and followers and discussed the artist's stay in the city, the works of those years, and his heritage. Then in 1999, which of course is the 400th anniversary of Van Dyck's birth, Hans Flieger and I organised a second exhibition held in Antwerp and London. Here again, we tried very hard to stress the totality of Van Dyck's work and to correct the assumption that he was supreme as a portraitist but less effective as a history painter. This, in my view, is one of the great canards of art history. And of course, as you see, it goes back all the way to Bellori through all the subsequent lives. But Van Dyck, as I'm sure this exhibition will have shown you, is a very great history painter. We tried to create a picture of his work as a whole, including key history paintings such as the Carrying of the Cross, which is here, the painting from the St. Pauluskerk in Antwerp, St. Martin dividing his cloak. We had both versions, the Zaventem picture and the British Royal Collection picture. Samson Delilah, which is here, the taking of Christ from Court. This is the other version of this early composition of the taking of Christ, of which the Minneapolis picture and the it's here. It's the Prado painting is in the exhibition here. And we had, which I miss here a little bit, the stoning of St. Stephen. Oh, later, which is later. Sorry, later. It doesn't. It's not pre-21. Sorry. I miss it because I love this picture so much. I think it's one of the outstanding history paintings by Van Dyck. We had the stoning of Stephen from Tatton Park, St. Augustine in ecstasy from the Augustinerkerk in Antwerp. We had the great blessed Hermann Joseph from Vienna. We had the great raising of the cross from Onze Lieve Frau in Kortrijk, and many, many others. And I hope and believe we made the argument effectively that Van Dyck was a great Reformation, counter-Reformation, a great counter-Reformation religious painter. We hope to show the great Palermo altarpiece, but despite heroic efforts, despite the agreement of the Archbishop of Palermo, which I personally negotiated, we were unable to prise it loose from the Oratorio del Rosario. And if you'll allow me just, I think, an amusing and actually significant footnote at this point, the exhibition was first shown in Antwerp with great success in 1999. It then travelled to London to open in September. As the principal organizer, I went away on my summer holiday, and I returned to London in September to find the exhibition had been largely hung by the Royal Academy's exhibition secretary, Norman Rosenthal. And I walked through the exhibition with him, and I realized that I couldn't find, and it was hard to miss because it's an enormous painting, the crucifixion from Kortrijk. And I said to Norman, "Where is it?" He said, "Oh, we didn't think that this picture would be appreciated by a London audience, and so we left it in Antwerp." And this is extremely interesting because it shows even in 1999, it's very difficult to change attitudes. It's very difficult to change this canard, this understanding that Van Dyck. So this picture, because it's very Catholic, very counter-Reformation, Norman had decided it wasn't to an English audience's taste, so it was left behind in Antwerp. But the whole point of borrowing it was to show this aspect of Van Dyck's work. We also included major examples of Van Dyck's work as a painter of secular, principally literary subjects, the Continents of Scipio from Christchurch, Oxford, the Ages of Man from Vicenza, the Amaryllis and Myrtillo from Pommersfelden, and his masterpiece as a painter of literary subjects, which you've seen before, the Cupid and Psyche from the Royal Collection. Surely a worthy successor to Titian's Poesia, and a painting that makes one deeply regret, the apparent loss of the other paintings of religious and secular subjects made during the English period and described by Bellori. I hope that here too the argument was made that Van Dyck was a supreme history painter in the tradition of Titian, but distinctly different both in technique and mood to Rubens. It was shortly after that exhibition, in 2004, Van Dyck, a complete catalogue of the paintings, was published. The authors were Nora de Porta of the Rubenianum on the first Antwerp period, Susan Barnes on the Italian paintings, Horst Fey, former director of the Museum in Karlsruhe, one of the author of the authoritative catalogue of Van Dyck's drawings published in 1962 on the second Antwerp period, and Sir Oliver Miller, former surveyor of the Queen's pictures on the English period. It's an immaculate catalogue. It's an enormous undertaking, 692 pages, absolutely authoritative, and it replaces all previous catalogues of the artist's work, most notably the catalogue by Gustav Gluck of 1931 in the Klassiker der Kunst series. There are 745 entries for accepted paintings and 82 for rejected attributions. The former are often discussed at considerable length with full literature, provenance, and discussion of copies and versions. And this, of course, is a particular problem during the English period when Van Dyck's studio, which we're just about to learn something of, made many, many replicas. And there is no more important publication, in my view, than this great catalogue. It is the key publication on Van Dyck, and it's the basis on which all further work must rest. Since then, more paintings by Van Dyck have come to light. There have been a number of smaller dossier-type exhibitions, notably a very beautiful show at the Dulwich Picture Gallery last year, based on the great portrait of the Viceroy, Emanuele Filiberto, of course painted during the stay in Sicily, and of course the paintings of St. Rosalie, of course a very fine painting here in the Prado of that series made during his stay in Palermo. The most recent exhibition is the present show here at the Prado, which I spent the whole of yesterday afternoon in, and I've been working my way through this monstrous catalogue which our colleagues here have produced. It's a thorough catalogue. I spent the whole afternoon yesterday in the exhibition, and I deeply congratulate the organisers. I'm very happy indeed to add their names, Friso Lammertse and Alejandro Vergara, to the roll of honour of Van Dyck scholars, which I have been outlining this morning. Thank you very much.